And welcome back. We are now going to dive deeper into looking at what we need to actually create what are known as objects in our programming language. So this is where the programming spike is going to take a little bit of a more of a learning curve than what we perhaps have seen before. Because if you've done any kind of basic programming, like for example Scratch or anything like you've done block-based coding, so you might be familiar with things like loops, conditions, etc. But now we're going to introduce this concept known as classes. And for us to actually kind of deep dive in this, we're going to kind of take it slowly before we kind of unleash everything that we need to know about how to use classes. So what exactly are classes? Well, classes are ultimately the single most important feature in a modern object-oriented programming language. We've already seen examples of classes. We've had the scanner class. We've had the strings objects, which are, of course, if you remember, are classes, not primitive types. And we've introduced previously the random class, which allowed us to see how we can start using different pieces of those objects. Now, an object is a value of what's known as a class type, and is also referred to as an instance of that class. Now, object differs from a primitive type in that both methods or actions and data exist as part of that object. For example, we say word equals hello. Well, we are assuming that's probably a string type, and so it's going to be an object of the string class. If we actually look at what comprises it, it has data because it has characters in the string data, and it's also going to have access to a number of methods such as length. So I can write out how long that is, or I can do things like to upper or to lowercase that can go ahead and then compare or change those values that I'm looking for. So let's actually get into defining a class. So take our first steps to making our own classes. Because of course, random was just another class that already exists that we could use. But what's if we want to make our own? And that's where the power is going to come in here. So we're going to go ahead and define a class called dateFirstTry. And we're going to create a program that runs code from that class. The dates, of course, are going to be objects of that class. And for our purposes, this is a pretty simple version of what a class is and how it works. But it's going to be perfectly fine for introducing this concept of what a class is. Now, a class in this case for us is going to have three pieces of data. These pieces of data are sometimes referred to as fields of the object, though more commonly you'll hear the term instance variable be thrown around. And so we're going to have three of these pieces of data. We're going to have a string for the month, we're going to have an integer for the day, and an integer for the year, because you think that's the typical format we can use. Now, we're only going to need one method right now. As we get later on, we might see, oh, we're going to need more of these. But for now, let's use one method. We're going to call that method writeOutput. And what's writeOutput going to do? Well, if you think about what the name of it is, it kind of might tell you what it is. It's going to write an output. It's going to take probably the month, day, and year and display it out to the user. Now, both the data items in this case and the methods that we can see here, which of course is just the one, are known as members of that object because they belong to that object. Now let's start breaking down some of those pieces. The first, of course, is the instance variables. If we look at those instance variables, there's three of them. Remember, we have a month, a day, and a year. So if we define them as such, public string month, public int day, and public int year, we're going to assume it's a 4-digit number. We'll talk about how to assure that these are valid later. The thing that we need to look at when we look at this definition, there's something new that's kind of been thrown out here. We've seen this term be used before when we see like public static void main args, but what does that mean? Well, the term public is a terminology that simply means that there's no restrictions on how these variables are used. And we'll explore a little bit more what this means in terms of the context of our program when we start introducing this idea of private variables. And that's something that we'll have to deal with later. But for now, what we're dealing with is perfectly acceptable just to simply have public in front of it. Now, an object of a class is typically named by a variable, therefore, of a class type. And we'll look at what that actually means when we look in our main program, what that's going to cause. Now, the next thing we need to talk about, though, is constructors. Now, while we're going to kind of take constructors and look at it in full in a later lesson, one thing we have to keep in mind is whenever we create an instance object, we're creating and using what's known as a constructor to do so. The general format of constructor is going to be like class type name equals new class type. And we're going to see this as we start putting everything together here in a minute with our main program. So this, of course, if you're used to how we kind of assemble variables, might look a little familiar because I always say it's a type a name equals a value. And of course, here it's a class type. We're giving it a name. We're setting it equal to, in this case, you'll notice something new here. It says new, which we'll talk about, and then a value, which is the class type. And there's the open and close parentheses here. What this is ultimately doing is creating a new object of the specified class, and it's associating it with a class variable. This is often referred to then as the object of that class. So, of course, we saw something new in there, which was this word new. What is new? Well, new is an operator that we can use to help us declare an instance of that object. Well, before we can kind of really identify all the different pieces here, we need a second class to test our code. Because you're going to have, now, we don't just have one main program. Before up to this point, we've had one class, we put everything in it, it runs, great. Well, now we're getting to where we need more than one class, because there's going to be times when having multiple classes is going to be hugely beneficial versus trying to shove everything in one class. That's one of the advantages of having object-oriented programming, is we can start segmenting things out into these different objects that allow them to have their own unique properties. Now, the second class can create objects, so let's say date 1, date 2, etc. And we can do so in the following format: date first try, date 1, comma, date 2, comma. So it's just like making a variable. If I had, let's say, an integer, I could say int num1, comma, num2. Same idea. However, while this is going to give us the variables, there are no objects of the class yet being used. Just like if when we had a variable, if we said like int num1, comma, num2 and num2 don't have values assigned to them. So if we want to obtain an object, we have to first use the new operator to create a new instance of the object, and hence the name new. The following would, of course, create an object of the class date first try, and would name it with the appropriate variable date 1. Date 1 equals new date first try. And so if I had this line of code up here, and they had this one here, you can, of course, then date 1 would have the proper setup. Date 2, we'd have to add another line of code. For example, date 2 equals new date first try, and then that one would also have an object. So this is going to lead us to our object creation statements. In our code, we could have two statements. We can have one to declare the variable and another to assign as an object. So for example, we have date first try, date 1, comma, date 2, date 1 equals new date first try, date 2 equals new date first try. And this is something that we kind of approach when we introduce the idea of variables. We can say, hey, we could say like int num1, comma, num2, and then we can say num1 equals 1, num2 equals 2. And that's perfectly fine. However, we can make our code cleaner. We can clean that up. We can do this with a single statement. Instead of having two statements to rely on, we can do one. So we could rewrite this code in a much simpler format. And this is pretty typically how this is done. There are, of course, some use cases when you're not going to do it this way. But generally speaking, whenever you're going to create an object with a class type, it's going to be done this way. So we would have date first try, date 1 equals new date first try, and date first try, date 2 equals new date first try. You'll notice that, again, all we've done is we've taken these pieces here and we just combine them into one line of code. So date first try, date 1 is this segment right here, and then the new date first try is coming from right here, and date 2 is right here. Now, I do caution, this is a common mistake I've seen when people first start coding, is they say, oh, well, first try and date 1, okay, well, that means this has to be date second try. Like, no, you don't need that. Or, they try putting date 1 here and then call it like new date. Remember, this for date first try name here is simply the name of whatever your other class is. If your other class was just called, let's say, date try, then this would say date try, date 1 equals new date try. Date try, date 2 equals new date try. And we're calling this date first try because we're going to make revisions as we kind of go along to make better and better versions of this class. But for now, this is a good starting point. So here I am in Eclipse with date first try, and let's go ahead and build this class based upon what we know. So we know we're going to have a couple variables. We have a public string month. We have a public int, and this is day. And we have a public int, which is year. And we just make a note that says this is a 4-digit. Then we have one method, which was the write output method. So this is simply just going to be a public void method called write output, open close parentheses. And whenever we do a method, it's always going to have curly brackets here. So you notice how these have curly brackets here. And inside here, I'm just simply going to do a system.out.println. And all I'm going to do is print out month. I'll say quote month plus month plus quote day and just make sure I concatenate in my appropriate variables here. All right. Now, of course, I can play around with this format a little bit if I want to try and get something that's going to look a little bit nicer here. So if I want to, for example, just print up month, day, year, and then maybe replace this with a comma, I could do month, replace this with, let's say, a space, day, and I'll make this a comma, year. All right. Now, how do we make that second class? Well, just like how we made our original classes here, I can just do the same process. I'm going to right-click it here in Eclipse. I'm going to do a new class, and I'm going to call this the date first try demo, or maybe I'll just call this the name of our lab. So this is lab 5.3. So this is what I'm going to call this one. I'm going to make my main, hit finish, and you'll notice, of course, we have our main here. Here we did not. And let's go ahead and create those objects. So we have our date first try, because that's the name of this class here, date first try.java. So just that, date1 equals a new date first try. And that's all I need to do to create an object of it. Same thing if I wanted to create a second one, I can do date2 and make a new, and I'm going to do date first try, open close parentheses, semicolon. Now if I want to actually do something with it, so let's say date1 dot, and you can see we got a list of things. So for example, I said date, month, year. So let's just say date1.day equals, let's just, since it's an integer, let's say 15. Date1 dot month, let's do that one now. And let's have that one equal April. And date1 dot year equals, let's just make this an integer, let's say 1992. All right. That's all the variables we need. I'm going to leave that just for a second here. Let's go ahead and call the output of this. So that we have date1 dot, and remember, there's a method here we made called write output, and that should display this to the console. So I'm going to go ahead and just run this real quick, see if we have any kind of problems. So just wait for Java to build this up, and boom, we get April 15, 1992. Now do see I have an extra space here, which is now probably going to go with my write output method. Take that extra space out. Perfect. Now, what's if I wanted to write date2? Well, if I try date2.writeOutput, and I go ahead and run that code, you notice we get null 0, 0, because we didn't actually set any of those values. So that means I need to come in here and say date2.day and give it a value. So let's just say 12. And let's go ahead and set a month to it. And let's have that one, let's say, be October. And then let's do one more. So let's say date2.year, and let's set that one equal to 1988. Sounds good to me. Those are all set. If I rerun that now, you see we get April 15, 1992, October 12, 1988. And that's all I need to do to go ahead and create and use objects of this class. And of course, I can add comments in here to describe what's going on, for example, and that can make my code a little bit cleaner. But this is going to give us the kind of the general flow of what we need to expect when we start using classes.